Welcome to Australian Fairy Tales, the podcast. The Australian Fairy Tale Society delights in taking a deep dive through time, culture and language to explore fairy tales from an Australian perspective and to discover what flesh they wear today. Through this podcast, you'll meet some of our fairy tale enthusiasts. So g'day, I'm your host, Annie Stewart, and it is my pleasure to welcome June Perkins, and we may or may not have some late additions to today's session. But first of all and foremost, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the elders past, present and emerging of the land on which we stand. That is the Yagara and Turrbal people in Brisbane. Welcome, Roselle. We'll get you to unmute and we're going to come to you in a moment. I acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which our listeners stand and extend a welcome to you and those of your country. June, where are you speaking to us from today?
I believe I'm speaking from Meanjin in Brisbane as the Turrbal and Yagara people who are the people of the land here.
And what about you, Roselle?
Yeah, I'm broadcasting from the Kumbumeri land, which is the Gold Coast, as we know it.
Very good. So what I'd like to do is to talk about you both a little bit and then to start teasing out some information for the upcoming conference. So first of all, we might go with you, June. You're a multi-arts creative born to a Papua New Guinean Indigenous mother and Australian father. You were raised in Tasmania as a Bahá'i and combined poetry, blogging, photography, story and more to explore themes of interest, peace, ecology, spirituality, cultural diversity, resilience and empowerment. What a woman.
Oh, that makes me laugh hearing that biography like that. I feel like I'm in an episode of This Is Your Life or something, but yeah, thank you for that introduction.
What then do you think of yourself as first?
What do I think of myself as first? I think first and foremost as a human being that loves the world, I think was where I would begin. So, yeah.
And so what drew you to fairy tales and stories then?
Look, I've always loved stories. My dad always used to read stories to us as we would go to sleep. And my mum tended to tell stories to us if we were going for a walk somewhere. And actually it was funny, I'd go walking with her and she'd say, oh, look under there, there might be spirits or fairies or something under a bridge or whatever. She was quite imaginative like that. But then there were also stories that she used to, I think songs that she would sing in language, and sometimes she would tell me what those stories were. And so I realized that, and then sometimes I would ask, but I didn't tend to ask when I was little. I asked more as I got older, and I appreciated and took more time to kind of ask her those stories and what the songs meant.
So the session you're both doing, and with Sharon, if she manages to get here today, is the Diaspora and Fairy Tales. So you, with your background, June, your Papua New Guinea mother and your Australian father, do you sort of feel like two senses coming in? How does it work for you?
Well, I grew up in Australia, so the Papua New Guinea that I experience is kind of filtered through my mother's diaspora. Like there's a level of complication there. And she came to Australia only in her 20s. So I'll save some of it for the actual festival because we go into that in much more detail. But my dad also is a diaspora type of person because he was English and raised in Tasmania. So he had a kind of mixed experience as well growing up there. So, yeah.
I always think it's interesting, like I'm fifth generation Australian, so I have no strong sense of that journey or anything besides being here. My surname is Stewart, so clearly there's some Scottish heritage, but that's 5 generations ago. How many great-great-great-grandparents that have sort of, mixed into me? But we might just go to you now, Roselle, for a minute. And I forgot to ask you how to pronounce your surname. Could you say it for me?
Tenefrancia.
Francia.
Tenefrancia. Yeah.
Tenefrancia. I wasn't
Yeah,
sure.
it's tricky because of the C.
Pardon?
So the letter C is pronounced SH.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you're from the Philippines?
Yes.
And you're a writer, editor, researcher, and lawyer. Since
Back there,
2012, you and your husband have lived on the Gold Coast, where you edit a local boating magazine.
Yes.
You volunteer for organisations supporting multicultural and marginalised communities.
Yes.
So how did you come to storytelling and fairy tales?
Well, I've always been an avid reader. So I think that's where it came from. And growing up in Manila in the 70s, that gives my age away, pretty much very westernized, very Americanized in particular. So my dad was a subscriber of Reader's Digest. And so he would always get catalogs for books, which is obviously books that are intended for American readers. But yeah, he would always ask us to choose, and I would always look at poetry books and fairy tales and all that. So even at a very young age, we were exposed to that a lot, even at school, because those were the stories being told at school. So I guess the difference with June is that her mother was telling the stories of Papua New Guinea stories. For me, I was being told stories from America or from Europe. So yeah, we never, as a young child, I was never really into that Filipino storytelling. It was coming here with my son that I decided that, I should tell stories to him, which is the opposite probably, like of me trying to learn from here. I'm now trying to learn what I should have learned when I was young, something like that. If you can, in
Yes.
sum, that's pretty much what I'm doing. Yeah.
And where do you collect those from? Do you have to pick them up from books, or do you talk to people from the Philippines? Or
yeah, the Philippines is a very good. They publish a lot of Filipino books, so it's easy to access them, and even online. I can just access them online, and it's everywhere pretty much. It's not, it's written, if that's what. A lot of those stories are written either digitally or in actual books, which I have a collection of at the moment. Yeah.
And do you learn those so you can tell them orally?
Yes, because my son refuses to read. He says I have to understand each word. So if I talk, maybe, it's more, I can explain as I talk. I think that's what it is.
And so with those stories, Roselle, you read them through, and then does something just strike you that you go, oh, I love that story, I'd like to share that? Or how does it work?
Yeah, it's something that, because growing up in a Western education system, it's pretty much the way it's being told. Even the Filipino stories would be told in the same way as probably the fairy tales of the Western world would be told. So it starts with once upon a time, but in Filipino. So it's the same. But I think there are stories that don't start that way, and those are the ones that actually strike me as significant in terms of sharing the stories.
Could you give an example of that? I'm not quite sure.
Traditional Filipino stories that have been passed on through many, many generations, and we're talking about thousands of years ago. So it's before the Spanish came to the Philippines. So it's pre-Hispanic, pre-colonial. I wouldn't say that because I think the Philippines has been colonized a lot of times prior to that, but it's the influences, it's prior to the influences of the other westernized countries, if that's what so these are all the indigenous people stories, and they're all different. It doesn't really you can't really pinpoint where it comes from, but because it's probably lost in a lot of that generation, and things happen and things change, and the Spanish didn't want that, so pretty much they just wrote it off as not part of our history.
Oh, sorry. So it's not so much tied to country then, like to places, or?
Yes, it is very much tied to the places. Like the Philippines is like Australia with a lot of different countries. Like when you talk to Aboriginals, they say that we're all from different countries who speak a different language. So yeah, the Philippines is the same, and probably the same in, the Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, and all those places.
And is that how it is for you, June, gathering stories to tell?
No, it's trickier than that, because my mum is remembering them from when she was, in her 20s. And I had a really interesting conversation with my family, because she kind of will get details from her cousins and from surviving family. And it's actually quite interesting. But yeah, it's a long story of how to connect with those, because I think when people migrate to a new country too, they often go through a period where they may not share as much as well. So I think that my mum went through a period of just trying to fit into Australia, and then we didn't always listen when we were little. But then I think she's kind of also reconnecting with those stories herself to fill the details in, because I come knocking and asking questions. So yeah, but that's a bit of a journey.
But that's interesting for our First Nations, where I'm from in Victoria, because so many people came to the gold fields and moved people on, and they were dispersed, and they didn't keep, they weren't supposed to tell their stories or their language. So a lot of white people would write the stories in books, and for some Indigenous people, there's just that sort of inkling. There's this fabulous Amina Meeks Blackwood, who's from Jamaica, she talks about an echo in the bone, so sometimes.
Oh, that's nice.
That, they might have little bits of it, and then they'll read this white fella stories. And of course, the white fellas often misunderstood or got it all wrong, but there's still sort of, that's where sometimes it's been recorded a little bit,
I would say that in the Philippines, it's pretty similar, because when the Spanish came, they pretty much Christianized the stories. And so what we have now probably written is actually that version of the stories, rather than the ones that are being told orally. And, and those who probably kept it as passing it on to generations. But it also got lost, as you were saying, it's probably also gotten lost with how it's interpreted or how it's understood by the ones who document it. So I think that's something that's in itself is a story.
So were the stories sort of for lessons, or were they for fun, entertainment?
I think, what stories you mean? Like
some of the folk tales or the stories you like to tell?
They're more, I don't think they're really meant to inform, but they're probably, like if I interpret it, it's something that makes you learn about your environment. So most of the stories would be based on the place where it was told. So, and if it relates to nature, then you can tell what particular thing that they described, either universal, you like, if you look at the stars and all that, then it's pretty universal, or it can be to a particular place. So I wouldn't say it's there to educate. It's just probably there to express what is there at the moment that they're telling the story. And that's, I think, for me, being here, being in a new country, I feel like, yeah, that's more important to me, that the story is really about where I am and what I see at the moment. Not I mean, research will help me understand the past, but where I am is also important, I think.
What about you, June? Is that the same for you?
You just I'm just thinking about that. It is partly where you are that inspires stories that you tell, because you're relating to your experience there. So I just find it interesting because the stories that I'm finding out from my grandmother, I'm sure would have had a context around them as well. And then the context changes slightly for my mum. And then when I'm hearing it, the context again changes depending on where we are. But there are details that are important, I think, for learning and preservation too. Like, yeah, there's really interesting things that happen when you ask someone to give you the details of the story and the process of, I suppose, excavating into it and discovering what it's really coming from. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, well, it does. My first proper job was children's librarian in the Darwin Library, and just sometimes asking Aboriginal people, it's like there's not always a beginning and middle and end, and you're not always going to get it here. You might have to travel somewhere before I'm going to give you that part of. Not that I'm a great expert on knowledge, but it's quite different the way people tell stories. And I suppose there's seasonal stories, there's young women's stories, there's I don't know, but it's such an interesting part of the reflections, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think, like, for me, being coming here as an adult, like a full-grown adult, 40 when I came here, it's a lot of my memory, of course, would be in the Philippines. Like, I haven't really built that much here, but I can, like, if I tell the stories now about things, like when my son was 4 years old, he started talking about things, and I just sort of started writing them down. And then we came up with a photo book where I drew a little bit to just come up with a storybook, but just for us, it's a personal storybook. And I thought, this is something that we can keep, and it's about our place here now, because it's from him that I took it from. So it's amazing how even my journey is, is different to what probably obviously my son, like his stories based on the present, and I don't always have to relate it to my story, if that makes sense. Like, I don't always have to put in, like, oh, you have to put in something Filipino there, I don't want that type of storytelling, like, it has to come out like because it means something, rather than trying to be informative or trying to be, try to educate people. I think that's not my main purpose for sharing the stories. It's really just expressing a lot of that me in there, but not necessarily because, there's something to be, some information. If there's history to it, then that's great. Like, if people will search it further and learn more about it, then that's great. That's a great beginning. But I think it's the storytelling bit is really just enjoying the journey. Like, I think June would agree that we're enjoying the journey so far.
I've really been enjoying just discussing with Roselle and with Sharon, because some of our experiences are similar and some things are different in the way that we view things. I think depending on, I suppose, as Roselle said before, like, my mum did tell me some stories from her village, even though they're embedded somewhere deep in my memory. And I remember once I had written some stories, and someone actually said to me they could see something Papua New Guinean in them. And I had never lived there. I haven't been back there to visit except through a Zoom to take some children for a poetry class. And so that astounded me, that somehow these lullabies and things that my mum was singing to my brothers when they were in a string bag hanging from the door, and something in the stories might have been absorbed in. And then, like, I just, the last conversation we had, I was getting shivers down my spine from some of the stuff Sharon was sharing with us. You're going to find that so interesting, because she was just telling us some of the, I want to keep that for the conference, but she's just like, I think our stories are also, there's some of the history And some of the journey with colonialism enters those stories as well, because, you know, I know that when my parents were first in Australia, my mum and dad actually experienced a bit of racism towards their marriage. And I think that experience is always going to be embedded somewhere in stories for me, that they just, their love brought them together. And, you know, love brings people to make big journeys. And I know, Roselle, you have a bit of a story about that, so I'm going to throw it back to you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I came here because of that, pretty much. I came here because I was married to an Australian. Yeah, but what we didn't plan when we met. We didn't plan to move here. It was just happened. And even my son wasn't born here. So that's also something that's I think that it makes a difference. I don't know, like with June, like, because my son wasn't born here and he's very aware of it. So he really, he's, you know, he strongly feels about it, that no, I wasn't born in Australia, but yes, I'm growing up here, but this is not where I was born. So, you know, he makes a point of it. So for me, it's like a surprise, because, oh, it matters. You know, I didn't realize it matters to him. So,
and so you want them to feel proud of their heritage, no doubt.
Yes. Yeah, it's I think that's very good that he took it upon himself. When he introduces himself, he actually introduces himself like, oh, I was born in the Philippines, you know, like, and it's like, oh, wow. Yeah, it's and I wouldn't start with that myself, you know, like, I think it's different for me as an adult. I don't know, like, things like that can come into the stories, I think, like what June is saying. I think that's part of the diaspora, right? Like, it does come into your stories, whether you mean it or not mean it, it will get in there.
And surely this is the richness of having you come to our conference. I'm new to Brisbane, so our conference, I'm really saying that, but to hear from different groups and viewpoints and, you know, ways of looking at the world, you know, until you've walked in somebody's shoes, how do you know sort of what's going on? But when I was speaking to you all the other day, just to sort of set this meeting up, you know, you're just so keen about wanting to honour the authenticity of your stories, which was something I found, you know, really interesting, humbling, just great to hear that.
Yeah, I think it becomes important to remember some of those details and where stories are coming from, even if things change over time, to understand the point of origin and why that story might have been told, I think can be quite powerful. And I think that a lot of stories, whether they mean to or not, they do, particularly with language, if they're being told in language. I think that was one of the conversations we had too, wasn't it, Roselle?
Yes,
and that are some things translatable across languages, or do you have to actually understand the context more? And while you still have people that can communicate that to you, it's very precious to go and ask those questions, like why my mum's still alive, and while I can, you know, build a bit of a relationship with home. So what do you think, Roselle?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what you're saying, that it's important, because for me as well, I'm rediscovering discovering maybe is the better term, the stories of the Filipino stories. And I think it is out of respect for that, and maybe my ancestors, you know, like, because I don't have that clear connection with them, you know, because they're really like, when my dad left his hometown, it pretty much cut off a lot of my connection with my dad's side of the family, because I don't even speak their language. So that's part of it. And if I have to tell a story in which was probably said in that language, then I have to be true to it. You know, I can't, and it does take a lot of research to ensure that, but I think it is important because it's personal as well. It's like what June is saying, it's part of our family and it's part of us. So yeah, I guess, and for the future generations.
I'm sure people will ask and will come up at the conference, the notion of cultural appropriation. I could probably go over to that bookshelf and pull out a book of Filipino stories, and my computer's sitting on 1001 Papua New Guinea Nights.
Yeah.
Is there a sense that there might be nursery rhymes you'd be happy for us to share, or do you think we shouldn't be sharing it? Like us storytellers, I'm from the Storytelling Guild.
Yeah, yeah.
Fairy tales. Or is it something, you prefer people not to do? Or are we a work in progress?
June should start. You have more experience.
Yeah, look, I think we have to think about why we choose stories and things that we want to share. I think there's a sense that a lot of, I suppose, people have felt that their stories have maybe been recorded and taken from them and taken out of context. I think one of the problems with some of the collections that have been done, someone will come, collect a whole stack of stories, put them in a book, take them away, and they get translated into another language, and they take a long time to come back to the community. And then sometimes, like Roselle said, now you can find them online or whatever.
Yep.
And sometimes I think that those contexts around the stories might get lost in that process if it's not also recorded. But I understand I think it's really important also for people to not stick with one culture that they learn about, that they're interested in other stories, and that they want to have these conversations, and that, if I want to appropriate Cinderella or another story too, I might appropriate it for like a talking back to colonialism type of thing for different stories, or there's those kinds of things out there, or even like the whole thing with women wanting to reclaim stories and retell them and say, I don't like the way gender's represented there, and I don't think culture is a stagnant thing that doesn't move on and develop and all those sorts of things. But coming back to your question, I think it all comes back to respect and why we're telling a story. And if we're worried about it, we just see if we can find the point of origin of the story and talk to someone from that background, like you are now, saying, how do you feel if I tell that story? And I go, well, I probably wouldn't even know if it was from the Mekio, because sometimes I don't have to know which province it was from, or and how did the people from that village feel, and would I probably go in and tell one of those stories, or would I suss my mum and my cousin out first and have a bit of a chat, and I'd think a little bit about it. But I also know that there's deep things that relate all of us to each other, aren't there? I mean, nature is everywhere, so we all think about the moon or the water or particular animals in our country, or dolphins, and dolphins mean different things across different cultures. So I know when I go looking for inspiration from things, that we find those things also carry stories for them too. I don't know if that really answers your question. I think
it's lovely.
It's like respect or something, isn't it? You kind of think about it a little bit, and the pause to think about it is important, because when you do that, then you are beginning to show respect, really.
But as you said, and a place like the conference that's coming up at the beginning of October is somewhere where it's so exciting to think that we can sit and discuss it, and it's our craft, our art, and we'll learn a little bit more. But the upcoming theme is Australian Fairy Tales, Flesh or Fossil. We'll finish up, but is there something about that theme that really appealed to you or has struck with you?
I think what you said before about the idea that you might have something that's deep in your memory, that's deep in your family, and then when you tell a story of it, you're breathing life into it. You're kind of you're bringing it alive again, or you're giving it life when you're telling it to someone. And there's something in that dynamic, isn't there, between the teller and the listener, and what's brought to life.
Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, definitely the flesh bit, because I said, like, coming from outside, I wouldn't want to think that it's like trying to dig up like fossils. It's really a dynamic, you know, storytelling is so dynamic. And I mean, we don't want, you know, we don't want, like, even language, we don't want it to go extinct. But if it does, then maybe there's something still there that is left to be told. So I think, yeah, especially with the multiculturalism concept that we have here, I think it is more of a living process, you know, like it's not going to end, because there's so many stories that we're telling each other, even just among us, you know, just the three of us. We're like, how many stories have we already sort of told each other, you know, and it's all different. So I don't think, yeah, I think that's really interesting, that the topic flesh or fossil, because it's very alive, I would say.
Well, I feel really honoured that I've been able to speak to you women, and I think your sessions are going to be great. So you're coming to the conference, there's the Diaspora one and Fairy Tales, and then you're doing one on tapping the wellspring of lineage as inspiration. So I suggest people get along to it. But thank you so much for coming and talking to me tonight. I'm your podcast host, Annie Stewart, and I've been talking to June and Roselle. All fairy tale enthusiasts are welcome to attend a fairy tale ring, either online or in their state, and or to attend the Brisbane Conference on October the 1st to the 2nd, 2022. There we'll explore the question, Australian fairy tales, flesh or fossil. To learn more, visit australianfairytalesociety.org, or our social media tag is @AustFairyTales. Once again, thanks, June. Thanks, Roselle, and I look forward to meeting you in person.